You know, before we get started, this is usually a kind of a weird way to start a workshop, but you know, we have the evaluation forms.
Should we fill out those now?
I'm really hoping you wait till afterwards, because I'm going to be kind of disturbed if at 2 minutes in I'm saying. I'm very distracting, but I am going to go ahead and pass these out just so you will have them.
Do you have any that you've pre-filled out?
Well, yeah. Presenter Allisyn Thomas. Fabulous. Best workshop ever.
That's what I was going to say. I don't have to think of something else.
I think so. I think you pass out the evaluation form. I'd love some water. That'd be great. Thank you. You all are so nice. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. We'll do our best to stay awake after lunch. This is a workshop on adult spiritual formation. My name is Allisyn Thomas. I'm currently serving as canon to the ordinary. The ordinary meaning the bishop. Okay, say, what is that? You know, it's fun because on Facebook, when I took this position, I've been there since November. She said, it's so fun to watch your career in the churches. You've gone from one obscure title to another. So, here you go. Anyway, I thought, I decided on hot or cold. I'm going to go for hot. I'm going to start with a prayer. And this is a prayer attributed to St. Anselm. O Lord my God, teach my heart this day where and how to find you. You have made and remade me. You have bestowed on me all the good things I possess, and still I do not know you. I have not yet done that for which I was made. Teach me to seek you, for I cannot seek you unless you teach me, or find you unless you show yourself to me. Let me seek you in my desire. Let me desire you in my seeking. Let me find you by loving you. Let me love you when I find you. Also, if you've not gotten, there's two
Can you hand that
handouts.
out, please?
Huh?
We want that in a handout.
You know, I can make that available. I did not. I should have. There are two handouts, however, on that chair. I think there's some left. One is the Lifelong Christian Formation Charter put out by the Episcopal Church. And I'm going to refer to that briefly. That's just, it's in English and in Spanish. And then is just a non-exhaustive list of web resources in this area, which I've divided into general information sites and programs. And once again, I know this is not exhaustive, but the nice thing, especially when you get into the first page on general information sites, is a lot of them have links to other sites. So, I mean, you could spend hours on this stuff, and it's amazing what happens when you move adult spiritual formation, some of which is horrifying, and some of which, a lot of which I found really helpful. So this is just for your information to do it as you please. So, given the limited amount of time, I'm going to give you some information. I welcome your questions. If I don't finish what I prepared, that's what God intended. So I don't feel a great need to necessarily give you all the information I have, even though it's amazing. Everything. Adult spiritual formation. But real quickly, could you just tell me what brings you here. I mean, the fact that we have so many people signed up for this particular workshop indicates to me that this is an area that people feel is either underrepresented in their churches, is being done well, is not being done well, or something you're just curious about. But if you, a couple of comments about what brought you here to this particular workshop?
Yeah, I do my own ministry, and I thought that this is something I really learn more about to make my ministry more effective.
I came as a layperson from a church where it was a big, full-on year-round church, and we had a lot of opportunities for classes and other things. And I'm in a small snowbird church, and so I'm having difficulty with how to offer things that I can get attendance. You know, when I do Bible study, I do lectionary, so that it doesn't require you being there all the time. And so really how to get people engaged in that. You know, I did EFM for 5 years and things where I don't think I could get people to do that.
So how to give an offering in a particular context?
I'm really passionate about convincing people that your spiritual formation didn't stop when Sunday school did.
Amen.
Thank God.
And I want some ideas for how to convince people of that.
Sunday school isn't the end.
Well, beyond Sundays.
Okay.
My church is, well, my rector is focused on youth, children and youth, and practically nothing in its office for adults.
Okay.
I'm interested in Christian formation for non-Christian thinking adults.
I'm listener, but non-Christian thinking adults.
Seekers, something.
I'll just put seekers. That's one word. One or two more?
I'd be interested in something that, you have all the Bible study groups and all those kind of things, but that's something that goes to the deeper sort of cracking us open a little bit more for the light to get in. Those things, maybe Lexio or
Okay. I will, I'm going to give you this disclaimer, which I thought Jimmy Bartz did at the beginning of his session this morning on tracking 20s and 30-year-olds. I've got no magic bullets. So if you're looking for, yeah. So, I mean, we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk more about creating a culture and some things to look for in context. But we'll do what we can. I'll try and remember that. Yeah.
The difference between Christian adult education and Christian adult formation.
Excellent. You want to teach this? Okay. Anything else that's not generally covered? Is this sort of a general list of what you're looking for? Well, let's see what we can do. So, I think I really want to start with this, because I think a lot of times when you hear the term spiritual formation, people automatically go to spiritual or education, more particularly Christian education in the context, because we're dealing with churches. And this is what kills us. Nothing wrong with Christian education. I'm for it. But when you look at it just that way, it'll kill you. Yes,
Can I ask you to speak out what it is that you're pointing to, because we can't see it now. Oh, wait,
it says education versus formation. And so that's just what I'm commenting on. When you hear spiritual formation, what do you think of?
Foundation. Very
Foundation, okay?
Group.
Group. So formation implies Something larger than the individual. Okay. Growing. Foundation. Something larger, beyond the self.
Continuous.
Continuous, hopefully. Anything else? What is spiritual formation?
Do you know exactly what it is that you are saying you're believing? Do you know the actual parameters that you know?
This is, here's some definitions that I pulled. And there is a spiritual community. They also have a good website called Renovari. It's one of the links that I've given. And when they talk about spiritual formation, this is in part what they say. We are all spiritual beings. We have physical bodies, but our lives are largely driven by an unseen part of us. There is an immaterial center in us that shapes the way we see the world and ourselves, directs the choices we make, and guides our actions. Our spirit is the most important part of who we are. You can agree with that or not, but I don't. And yet we rarely spend time developing our inner life. This is what spiritual formation is about. Spiritual formation is a process. And if you remember anything from today, it's about process, not program. The moment, once again, we start thinking about program, we're going to get killed. Spiritual formation is a process. It is a journey through which we open our hearts to a deeper connection with God. We are not bystanders in our spiritual life. We are active participants with God, who is inviting us into relationship with Him. Richard Rohr, a great spiritual thinker, according to him, spiritual formation is, at least in part, about learning to trust our own experience. We experience God in a whole lot of ways, and we discount it. So he's saying it's learning to trust your own experience. He says we must always remember that God's first revelation is creation, the cosmos, and for us, the earth. God is revealing God's self in creation, and we are part of that. There is an inner witness, soul, that has the capacity to relate to God.
Amen.
So, finally, the last one is the spiritual life is simply increasing the vitality and sway of the Holy Spirit within us. If we proclaim we are made in the image of God, clothed in Christ, our encounters with God help reshape us into the image of Christ. That is spiritual formation. We are being reformed. Spiritual formation invites us to consider what or whose form we are seeking. What in our personal or corporate life needs to be reformed. So, it's a process. It is a lifelong process. And finally, just as you look at this, this charter, the Episcopal Church of God invites all people, inspires all people, transforms all people. It's ongoing. There is no end result. One of the scariest things about spiritual formation is at times you will feel farther from God than at other times, because you have to be willing to engage in a journey, and that's part of what we do as adults. Richard Rohr, in his book Falling Upward, talks about how the first half of life is where we build this container, the self, where we develop an identity. Maybe we get a career, we get a partner, we get married, we decide we like broccoli, whatever. Whatever it is that helps define who we are as people. The second half of life is about letting go of that container. The container is important, it's not that, but letting go of that and filling it. And really seeing what's essential. How are we going to fill this container? It's a great book, Richard Rohr, Falling Upward. So spiritual formation is important because it helps us reclaim our relationship with God. It's not trying, it's training. in eternal living. Determine discipleship to Jesus Christ and the way we discover the renewable source of spiritual energy we've been looking for. It's a process, not a program. So, why does spiritual formation in our parishes so often go wrong? And there's two things that tend to happen. There could be a lot of reasons, but two that we tend to see is that there is our starting point is on content instead of persons. We are so concerned about making sure we have a Bible study. Bible study's good. We don't know why we want a Bible study. We don't know if anybody even wants a Bible study. But, we think about content, because there's a lot of programs out there, a lot of good programs. So we tend to look at the content over the persons. And our preferred methods often involve education of the head rather than formation of the total person. So, does that speak to people? Anybody want to say no? No? Okay. So let's step back then. There's a great book called Soul Feast by a woman named Marjorie Thompson. But,
Sorry,
you studied it?
we're reading it for Lent.
Jesus is good. It really is a good book, and it's an invitation to the Christian spiritual life. She may have a newer one from the one I read, which was in 1995. I wouldn't be surprised. No, I'm so old. But and it's a book that really looks at spiritual practices, among other things, and why that's important in Christian spiritual life. But she talks about part of the reason this is so important is that we have this great spiritual hunger. Human beings have this great spiritual hunger. And she says this is attributed in part, it's more complex than I'm going to make it, but she divides it into three areas. There's cultural, personal, and spiritual factors for this hunger that we feel. Cultural. Western culture, and that's who we're talking to today, is steeped in rationalism ever since the Enlightenment. So I call it the focus on facts rather than truth. So we're steeped in rationalism. Technological advances, and I'm going to talk more about that later because this is huge, is creating both opportunity and anxiety. I believe that people should be really technologically astute and savvy. Notice I don't have a PowerPoint. Actually, that's one of those things. I really should learn how to do that. We live in a culture that glorifies superficial values. Isn't it amazing that reality TV just is so important? It's like, really? What? And our culture is increasingly paralyzed by fear. But I'm going to add, and this is, once again, what she wrote then, I'm going to say polarization as well, which is probably based in fear as well. So that's part of the hunger. The personal factors is suffering and tragedy seem to be powerful catalysts for moving people towards spiritual perspectives in life. It's amazing how many people don't darken the door of a church until someone dies or someone's really sick. And that's okay. It's all in God's time. But that may help awaken that hunger. People are restless and dissatisfied with church as they experience it. And that's creating hunger. And the corollary to that is people are having these amazing spiritual experiences and encounters with God, and they don't feel safe to bring them to church. And finally, the spiritual factors. Human beings are, she says, innately religious. I say innately spiritual. Now, I think they're religious also. but I don't necessarily see the same thing. I tend to look at religion as being a little more rule-bound. It's okay. It's good to have parameters and to know what you believe. It's also important to not let those define the whole of who you are, the whole of what is a sacred. We want the transcendent in our lives. People want it. My husband, who's characterizes himself, lately he's calling himself an evangelical druid.
Wow.
He's not. I don't know. I haven't seen him hug a tree. But even someone who characterizes himself as a non-believer, nonetheless, I think sometimes it's interesting to look at the stuff. It's often to look at the stuff that comes out, or hear the stuff that comes out of his mouth. Nonetheless, he wants some way to describe or to look at those transcendent moments. It could be looking at his daughter at any given time. Right, there's some chairs here if you want to. There's one here. Unless you want to stand up, and if there's a couple chairs. And unless we have some sense or experience of the sacred, there is an existential emptiness at the core of our being. Life can be very dry if we don't have some way to experience the transcendent in our lives. And finally, she says that God is the primary factor behind the spiritual seeking of our time. It's a good thing that God doesn't depend on our belief. Because we'd be in big trouble. It makes me think that several years ago, I was at the cathedral before I came to work for the bishop, and part of my duties included overseeing liturgy, which at the cathedral is a big deal. I mean, it's a big deal everywhere, but there's a lot of liturgy that takes place there. And I was running around during Holy Week, and I remember I was running, from A to B, and I'm going, oh my God, how am I going to get this all done? Just help me get all this done. And it's like this voice from heaven came and said, just spend time with me. So I think rather God is as obvious as God has to be with me, that God seeks to truly be in relationship with us. So because this is such a critical area and participation is often not what we want it to be, we tend to address the issue in the negative. If there's this spiritual hunger and plenty of good information and program out there, why isn't there more participation? We're coming from it from a negative perspective. I think it is helpful to reframe the question. In 2011, leaders from across the country in the Episcopal Church who were involved in spiritual formation got together to talk about the future of faith formation in the Episcopal Church. And by the way, this is also one of the links that I gave you to this study, Building the Continuum, the Episcopal Church Summit on Faith Formation. For those of you who are nerdy, they go into their whole, how they studied it, their methodology. I like this stuff. I was fascinated. But I really like what they did initially. I like a lot of what they did. They reframed the question, how might Christian lifelong formation over the next 10 years affect the renewal and transformation of the Episcopal Church for the 21st century? Let's stop talking about what we don't have. And let's talk about what we have and where we're going. Because when you talk about what you don't have, or when we talk about what we don't have, I feel like, who knows Winnie the Pooh? I feel like Eeyore. So let's not be Eeyore. So in other words, what is it that we're trying to do with faith formation? Because if we're clear about the purpose, putting together a spiritual formation culture, not a program, culture in your parish is going to be a lot easier. You really have to think about what it is you're trying to do. Because all too often we approach it from the other way around. As I said, let's have a Bible study, let's have Alpha, let's have the media, let's have education for ministry, EFM, let's have a Wednesday night healing service. All good. May not fit in your context, may not be terribly helpful. We tend to look at, well, we've got all this, we just plug in all these programs and somehow people are going to come. Not necessarily. And the biggest one of the biggest ones I hear has to do with Bible study. Why do you want a Bible study, I ask. Well, we're Christians. We should know about the Bible. Well, how is knowing about the Bible going to transform or renew us? Crickets. They don't know. Maybe we have to talk about that and educate people about how it's going to do that. But I think, once again, it's like, how does having a Bible study fit into your overall congregational spiritual formation? Know why you're doing what you're doing. Think about your congregation in the context of where you live. EFM probably wouldn't work in Borrego Springs. But think about your congregation and how and where it needs to be renewed. What's going well? Where is there a lot of energy? That tells you a lot. Where is there energy? Own it. Live it. That's a gift from the Holy Spirit. And where does it just die? Pay attention to those moments of when you can feel the energy, because that's telling you something. The other thing that I've noticed is that we tend to, because we do have this focus on program, because folks, we're tired and we're busy. And I get it. There's been times, I need a Wednesday night, just when I was at the cathedral, because the other part of my responsibilities there was, I was in charge of spiritual formation. And when I first came there was no program. So it's like just throwing things in. You know, it took me a couple of years to finally figure out all this stuff. We need to have something on Wednesday nights for Lent. Okay. Well, we need to have something, post-Easter. And really not thinking about how those fit into the whole. Should there be a connection between what happens in Lent and post-Easter? What a concept. But, and given our attendance in summer, maybe we do something that still fits into what the congregation needs overall, but it's a little lighter, because that's where people are at. It's just, take a look at it. You really need to do some strategic thinking. And here's the sort of paradox in all of this, is it helps to take a look at the year, and looking in the context of the liturgical year is really helpful. Thank God for our seasons. So take a look at the seasons and say, these are the kinds of things that maybe God is asking us to take a look at, or that we could address. But how do they fit one to another? And how do we also give ourselves enough flexibility to change midstream? Have a plan. Don't let the plan own you. Own the plan. A little bit of thinking helps. Okay, comments, thoughts?
So Allisyn, do you think that part of the problem here is we tend to focus on that magic ASA number, and so we've got, would living the questions have been successful if we only had 20 people there instead of 100 people?
Yes, it could have been, actually. I've seen it done in small parishes. But living the questions would only be successful in a certain type of parish. So it's not about numbers, it's about culture of the parish. That particular piece. And it was a strain even for some.
It seems that there's some value in jumping in with any one of, you talked about, okay, I need something for Lent. But there's some value in jumping in with something that catches your eye and to learn from that, to gain that language of identifying that hunger.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And sometimes we do, because we do what we can. You know,
Do what we can,
you know, in an ideal world, we'd have a couple years to study it, you know, maybe do some surveys, and all. None of us live in an ideal world. And part of what jumping in can help us do is to learn what works and what doesn't. But to always be cognizant of what's working and what's not, and be willing to let go of what doesn't.
I heard you say two things that sounded opposite to me, so I need you to connect the dots for me a little bit. You said, quit looking at what you don't have. But then you said, look at where you need to get renewed. To me, that sounds like looking at what you don't have, so can you get those to work together for me?
I think when I was talking about what you don't have, I was thinking in terms of resources.
Oh, okay.
So thank you for asking that. We're a tiny parish. We don't have many people. We don't have a lot of money. We don't have this. We don't have that. So I think sometimes we let our resources box our thinking. But also in the context of the small, often very lively, spiritually alive parish, we can take a look at them. What bolsters that? Thank you. Yes.
What worked for us, and actually would never work for us, is something coming from on a high. You know, getting up and saying, this is what we're going to do for you, this is what you need, that kind of thing. And so we started our adult formation program 3 years ago with a parish-wide survey of trying to solicit what the hunger is. What
And you are, I'm sorry, where?
St. Paul and Vesper.
Okay.
And it worked. We had a gazillion responses and tried to kind of blend what was needed and what are the priorities and so on. And the program has been going for 3 years. And it runs the gamut of scripture, comparative religion, spirituality, and Richard Ward's book, and so on. But it came from the need.
Absolutely. You know, any of us who've been involved in a parish for any amount of time know this to be true, that this kind of thing works if it happens from the inside out rather than from the top down.
Can I give an example of what worked in our...
Please, and you are where? Holy Cross, I say. Okay, yes.
We're a mission church. We have probably 55 members. So we decided to do a study on studying the creed for those who like to cross their fingers behind their back when they're saying. There were 27 at the first meeting, and by the time we got to the third meeting, it was still up in the high 20s.
That's awesome.
And we had a great time of questioning. And part of what came out of that was almost everybody in the parish has now read the Zealot, which is and I should say our mantra is open minds, open arms. So,
right.
So it fits in with them very well. The very questioning thing helped us think about what our faith was and what was really our faith, what our faith really was.
Yeah. And you know, when you said that, it made me think, and sort of alluded to this before, it's amazing how church can be such an unsafe place to ask questions. And what I'm hearing is, in this case, it was sacred, safe space was created, which is so important for adults. Adults need to be able to ask questions. Adults need to wonder. They need to go through periods of belief and periods of unbelief. I mean, you know, when we look at our spiritual life, the course of our life, there's going to be times when we're more in tune than others. So that's a great example. And it also helps, that in turn, helps create a culture for further formation in the context. Because now you've had this safe experience, and the people of Holy Cross have a better idea of who they are. And that will be attractive.
By the way, that was almost all lay led, by the way.
Gosh, and it still worked. Wow, yeah, good job. No, I'm glad it was. We when I was at the cathedral, found that was often the case, that so much wisdom was found. And in fact, we couldn't do a lot if we just depended on the clergy. So this allows faith formation to go deeper. Okay, some considerations as you think about all this. Technology. Technology is huge. Once again, returning to that group in 2011 of spiritual formation, Christian formation leaders who got together to talk about all this stuff, they identified a whole list of what they called uncertainties. Questions about things happening in the mostly in the world that will affect formation. And technology was one of two that they considered primary. And the second was responsiveness of the Episcopal Church to the world. Technology. Will the evolution of how we communicate with technology foster community or diminish it? Will it increase community or increase solitude? There's no right or wrong answer. Well, actually, they would say yes. Get adept at technology. You have to. I mean, maybe I don't. I should. Maybe I'm not yet. But I have to make sure that somebody around me is. You know, we're not all gifted in the same way. But unless you understand, or if you have a young person who can help you with technology, the church will become increasingly isolated and left behind. We need to be able to connect via technology, but we also have to make sure at the same time that people don't become little isolated people at their computers. But you have to know technology. And the other question I thought was so interesting, they said, with the coming of age of the first generation of digital natives, and I think you know who they are, an unprecedented global connection, will people thirst for more personal connections or be content with increased isolation? A couple years ago, to me it was about a year ago, the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes had their conference here in San Diego, and I was able to attend. And there was it wasn't a TED Talk, but it was a talk. It was in one of the conference rooms where it showed a baby playing with an iPad. And the baby was, expanding it, just all the things that you can do on a phone or your iPad or now a lot of computers. And then the baby was in a magazine and was trying to do the same thing and was so frustrated. This magazine doesn't work that way. So really, for that baby, that is normal. So we're really looking at people as they grow up in this environment who are looking at technology different. They're digital natives. So we have to, and I think this is all good, but we have to contend with it. The second thing they found was responsiveness of the Episcopal Church to the world. And the question they asked, the unknown they asked, is will the Episcopal Church become outward and mission-focused or inward and maintenance-focused? This is so important when you think about formation. Part of the fear and polarization that we see going on in the world, I think, makes us want to turn inward. We want comfort. We want the grilled cheese sandwich of faith. Want to feel good. Want to go in on Sunday morning and the liturgy is the same. And the music is basically going to be the same. And I'm going to see the same people. And I love these people and they're great. And now that I'm no longer part of a national church community and sort of a wandering Aramean, I see this in all the churches. Understandable. We want to be with our people, our posse. But it can also make us inwardly focused. And for those of you who heard Jimmy Bartz's talk this morning, I think it's the same thing. It's like we really have to start thinking about what's keeping us inwardly focused and what it's going to take to get us to be outwardly focused. And part of it is meaning we're going to get, I think, a lot in return, but we're going to have to give up some things as well. And to start thinking about what's essential. So we look at the creeds, and we look at various things and say, what is essential here? and allow the Spirit some room to breathe. Maybe that's as good a definition of spiritual formation as is opening ourselves up to the point where we can allow the Spirit to breathe and actually take root and help us grow. Will spiritual engagement take place within the walls of the church or outside the walls of the church? All too often, and I get it, we're asking how we can get people into our churches. Once again, I think it's the wrong question. How are we going to get out among and with the people? They may come to church on Sunday, or they may not. Does it matter? I think that's a question we have to ask ourselves. If we don't worship on Sunday, how are other ways in which we worship, which, by the way, is a huge component of formation. It's amazing how often people think of spiritual formation and don't include worship.
On that same theme, isn't feeding the homeless a spiritual formation? Well, why does that have to be separate? I mean, to me, when you talk about process and all that, it's those various things that engage us in the holy and the divine and each other. And so, if it's fellowship, it could be spiritual formation as well. I mean, to put a label on it that it's just intellectual is to me is not really looking holistic.
Right. It's amazing the labels we use and how on one level they can be helpful because they help us define things, and on the other they help us compartmentalize things. And I think, feeding the homeless, that's mission. We're engaged in mission. Well, who said mission is part of spiritual formation? But no, that spiritual formation is when I pray or when I do this, and it's got X, Y, and Z. And it's to start looking at the whole of what we do in the spiritual context. You may never have a adult Sunday school class in your parish. Is spiritual formation happening that's rigorous? Absolutely can. Just look at how we're doing it differently. Some other factors they said that are unknowns are spiritual nourishment. Will people search for spiritual nourishment, lead them to embrace organized religion, or turn away? I think that's a really key question for us to talk about or to think about. And if they are turning away from, say, going to church or somehow participating in church, what is it that they're finding attractive outside of church? I'm not saying we need to be conformed to the world at all, but I'm often curious when people find other things spiritually nurturing, what it is that they're getting.
I was going to say no commitment. Outside the church, you can have spiritual nourishment without commitment.
That's true. You can. Okay.
It's the whole, when I look at the younger people relative to me, especially people who are non-Christian or they are not solid in their Christianity, the whole environment is as such that today you can go this way and tomorrow another way and it's all good. Because a bunch of other people are going in that direction, so it must be good. So when you go with that mentality, you can actually lose what you were supposed to grow and get close to.
Right.
Some people consider a great model of adult spiritual formation to be Alcoholics Anonymous. And I don't know a lot about the structure of it, but I know that there is nobody in charge. There isn't an 815 East or anything like that.
815, by the way, is the Episcopal Church's center in New York. Those of you who don't know.
But I know that there is no one person in charge. Everybody is invited to participate. And if they don't want to, that's okay. If they have something to share. So I don't know if there's a kernel in there. Might be something. But I do know some people, or I've heard it said that some people in AA say they get more spiritual renewal in AA than in any church.
Or any form of 12-step program.
It's the brotherhood that they form. It's the brotherhood that you form not being judged. You expect not to be judged, so therefore, you form that brotherhood.
And I think the fact that, and you've hit upon, both of you brought up an important point, is that there is a loose structure to it, too, which is fine. Often we need a little structure. But there's community that forms. And that is, I think, one of the many advantages to AA, but that's one of the advantages to 12-step programs. The loose structure, everybody's invited to participate. It is fairly horizontal in its leadership, and community gets formed. But I want to address the other issue of commitment. And certainly, when you look outside the church, you can find just that I'm going today, I'm going to the mosque tomorrow, I'm going to do yoga on Thursday, and there can be an element of that. Nonetheless, that still tells me something positive. What's happening during yoga that somebody finds so attractive that they are doing this? So it's not just, I don't want to be judgmental about it. I want to take the positive out. What can I learn that's positive? And what that might tell me is that I myself, or the community in which I'm engaged in, has a need for contemplative practice. That's information. Don't judge it, it's information. And maybe right now somebody doesn't want to be committed. They don't want to be committed, they don't want to be committed. It's not, that can be part of it. But I think it's the movement of the Spirit that maybe in this noisy, extroverted world, and Facebook, for instance, or Twitter, it's very extroverted activity. But maybe in the midst of all that, people need silence and space. And so, how do we start incorporating that into the spiritual formation of our particular worship community? So it's like, look for the information that it tells you. There's a lot of churches that have engaged in 12-step spirituality, not necessarily with Alcoholics Anonymous, Al-Anon, Narcotics Anonymous, or any of those, but to get into the 12 steps themselves. And have found that tremendously spiritually renewing. Pay attention. Take a look. For instance, if you have a church that has a lot of 12-step programs, now a lot of times they're not people who necessarily go to the church, it may be interesting to say, gosh, there are a lot of people who come here. I wonder if we did just a more general 12-step program, if that's something that might be of interest in the context of this community. That's some information. I'm kind of curious about it. Let's try it. Let's see what it tells us. If everybody goes to yoga on Thursday, then maybe we should have a yoga class. Maybe we have a night at the yoga. You don't necessarily have to have it in the church. It's like there are 10 of us that are going to go to yoga and then get together for dinner afterwards and talk about how we experience God. Oh, I thought you. So, another factor is cultural ethnic diversity. We live in a culturally, ethnically integrated. Will we live in culturally, ethnically integrated communities? Easy for me to say. Or will we live in communities segregated by culture and ethnicity? We talk a lot about how it's good to be the inclusive church. I think still a lot of times, and once again, I'm speaking to the choir, this one. There's a certain comfort of being around people who are like me. But that's not the reality of our world anymore. The global realities. And so it's like learning to deal with that. And in the midst of that, what does that tell us about God that we would not know otherwise? The fact is that I'm exposed to these different religious traditions now. Is telling me something about God and telling me something about spiritual practice I never knew anything about when I was growing up. So, God just all of a sudden got bigger. So let's celebrate that. It's not necessarily something. It's not something we have to be afraid of. Then church and human diversity. Will the Episcopal Church be open to engaging the increasing diversity of people, or will it be resistant to engaging this diversity? One of the things Jimmy Barnes talked about in his talk this morning was about, and we were talking a little bit about it a little bit before this workshop started, is that they don't have a church building. They don't even have a space they regularly rent. They might be in a space for a month. They might be in a space for 6 months. They might have the space they're renting, but they're not going to meet there on Sunday because there's something happening, as I was saying, in West LA that they're going to go participate in and then talk about or have some sort of worship afterwards. And they do it by email and Facebook, and this is where social media can be really great. A good friend of mine who used to be in this diocese, Rhonda McIntyre, is now in New Mexico, and the church where she is, actually she's now the rector, is a little church, probably about the size of this room, in a shopping center, in a little strip mall, and it's thriving. And the fact that they don't have a site they have to take care of, they're not, they're paying rent, but the landlord is paying for the upkeep and all that stuff, is allowing them to use whatever resources they have in a completely different way. And a lot of it is, in their case, in San Gabriel, it's the name of the church, really focusing on outreach. And so that community, and I don't know, I think it's 100 people, that community is out there all the time, outreach, serving, worshiping, teaching. They're freed from their building. But for some of us, and I was at the cathedral before that, which I love that space, so that's a little like, ugh. But we have to start looking about these things. And not that we need to get rid of all our buildings by any means, but it's to allow for that there's other ways to look at this. So, some practical considerations. I'll give you a few things. The people who know this stuff and have studied it said that there tend to be, for adult formation, 4 areas that adults seem to be drawn to. So when you're thinking about what you're doing. One is biblical knowledge and understanding. People really do want to know more about the Bible. But I think they want to know what to do with the Bible today. Episcopalians don't tend to be very, really Episcopalians aren't fundamentalists. You've got some who are going to be more theologically conservative in how they look at Scripture than others. But we need to have some greater biblical understanding and how it applies to my life today. It's well and good to know about Noah's flood. What does that tell me? What does that tell us? Really more importantly, what does that tell us? They tend to be drawn towards things that help them in moral decision making. Interpreting new situations in light of faith. Ethics. And issues that we face in our lives. Illness, death, cultural pressures. When I was starting to put together the forum series at the cathedral, and really, well, it's funny you should say that. It's like, oh, Bill, you're breathing? Well, you're going to teach next week's forum. There came a certain effort, but in about a year's time, I began to see what worked and what didn't. And really, this whole idea of how it helps us live moral lives and deeper spiritual lives tended to be the forums that brought the most people in. I can have a great forum, and I'm not saying this with pride, but necessarily on a social issue, maybe 20 people. I can have one on, and I got in touch with a lot of people at University of San Diego and have someone come in and talk about faith in the age of 9/11 and the place would be packed. You know, we have to pay attention to these things. Obviously, now sometimes you really do have to learn about these other things as well, but that told me something. The third one is multicultural awareness, is learning to appreciate the contributions of other religious traditions and other cultural traditions. To study people from other cultures that have influenced our faith. Gandhi has had a tremendous influence on Christian faith and spiritual formation. It wouldn't hurt to know more about him. How he got there. How he influenced Dr. King. I mean, so it's like, once again, just looking at these things. It's important for us to listen to stories of people from other backgrounds. And to use resources from other faith traditions or cultural perspectives. I taught, this is not adults, but my first job at a seminary was at St. John's in Chula Vista, and part of what I had to do was teach religion to the middle school. They have a parish day school, was teach religion to the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. Now, I was an attorney before I was a priest, and I had no teaching background whatsoever, so that was terrifying to start with middle schoolers. But one of the things I found that they really liked was studying world religions, because it was so different, it was so interesting. So we'd engage, and I remember the Muslim prayers, so we'd get our little prayer rugs and, doing things. And then afterwards we would talk about, what does that teach you about your faith? What does that teach you about Jesus? What does that teach you about what happens when you go to church? And one of the things, this is a paraphrase, is that it got them off autopilot. So I think we can do a lot of that with adults too. And finally, global awareness. People tend to be, at least in the West, interested in environmental issues, ecology, world hunger, political oppression, and world debt. People care about what's going on in the world. People are scared about what's going on in the world. People want to affect what's going on in the world. And once again, then learning to integrate that as part of our formation process. When I participate in creation care, what does that tell me about God? To start looking for things that we do, maybe in other parts of our lives, that we don't tend to think about. A couple of weeks ago, I think it was the Washington Post ran an article on a man named Mike McCurry, who was the press aide during the Clinton years, which is euphemistically called the Whitewater and Monica Lewinsky years. And so this was a man who was used to being in uncomfortable situations, and yet he became increasingly concerned that maybe what he was doing was not affecting the greater good. And even though he'd gone to church all his life, he also realized he'd never really thought about how going to church influences his Monday through Saturday experience. Church was a sanctuary for him. And so when he finally left the White House in 1998, he started taking seminary classes. And now he's teaching at a seminary on religion and politics. And he considers that infinitely more terrifying than being press agent, because he's talking to 12 people versus, a camera where you might be talking to a million. But it's also like learning to see, gosh, the things that I learn in church really do affect my moral decision making, really do affect how I look at what's going on in the world, how I treat people, what my assumptions are. That in turn allows me to love my neighbor. Hopefully will help me to learn to love my neighbor in a new way. So with adults, there's some core values. And this is, I hope, please, this I think was so important when I read this a couple years ago. is to embrace the gift and responsibility of being a particular community of faith. Every community of faith. To accept the gift and responsibility of being a particular community of faith. St. Mary's has something to show us about God that we would never know otherwise. St. Dunstan's, Holy Cross, I mean all the communities represented here. And to embrace your particular uniqueness. It's a gift. Small, large, medium, whatever it is. And so to start thinking about what it is unique about this particular community. Adults like it when we nurture and support one another, not just for our personal growth, but to fulfill the mission of the church, which is once again to get away from this, it's just all about me. But adults like being part of a community. And so we look at formation as something that will help me grow as a person, help my community grow as a person. To recognize and respect that each member of a community of faith is engaged in a lifelong journey of faith, and it's not limited nor solely dependent on the community of faith. Hopefully people are going to get part of their spiritual formation outside of church, outside of that particular community, and that is good. Part of what we do is help nurture that awareness for each other. We can do that. Spiritual formation for adults should challenge and equip adult members to assume personal responsibility for their own spiritual formation. Adult spiritual formation should not focus necessarily on developing new programs, but rather developing new patterns of living. New patterns of living. To avoid preempting the spirit by prematurely naming goals. I mean, it's good to have goals. I have goals. But to allow some space in there to be surprised by the Holy Spirit. Once again, if something isn't working, own it. Or I'm not sure how we're going to do this, but maybe I can do this if I call the people over here and together we can do it. So allow that. Don't over-control. That's hard for us. Oh, I shouldn't say it's hard for me. I'm sure not true for you. That all too often what we're seeing is that in the desire to have some sort of cohesion within a community of faith, that the leaders, and this is clergy and lay, will try to over-control the offerings. If somebody really wants to have a book study in their house, the book looks okay, and they're willing to organize it, allow those moments to happen. If somebody says, well, you know, you get the point. It's just, it certainly should not be clergy-centered. Don't over-control. Adults don't do well with that. We've got our life experiences. We've made it this far. Chances are we're going to be able to, God willing, we'll be able to get home today. But to own the fact that we've got life experience. And this is something that you may or may not agree with. In fact, I'm going to ask if you do. Accept that a primary responsibility of a faith community is to have vibrant worship.
I agree with that.
Define vibrant worship.
Where people aren't asleep in the pews.
Oh, okay.
Or asleep in the chairs. Or they're falling off the chairs. That worship is something, you get the sense, can we just get through this? Because vibrant worship is going to be different, you know, within the charism of any given community. But to really make that a priority, because folks, for a lot of people, that is their spiritual formation, and it's fine.
And that's a community responsibility.
Absolutely.
It's not the show
at the altar, it is a community responsibility to, it's the work of the people, and people, it's really got to be community.
Yeah.
And for me, it's also got to be an otherness community, not a groupthink community. I think sometimes we get the idea that we have to all believe the same thing, whether we be on one polar side or the other. And I think, to me, it's an opportunity to have that diversity, and so that we can appreciate the other for who they are. And so I think it's important that our process be to open us up to those things.
Absolutely. Vibrant worship. It's really important. We're going to be church. That's a big deal.
Then last year we were in Philippines. I felt that the young people in church, they had more influence of what was happening in this specific church, and that's why it was so alive. In other words, all the elders were allowing the youngsters literally to take over. And the music was so loud and so live, but everybody was involved.
Which once again gets back to the don't over control. It's hard for us liturgists to not over control. Build the faith community from the inside out, not the top down. Provide a warm, welcoming manner. Use available and emerging technology to enhance and unleash creative energies. So, the last thing I think we'll be able to get to is there's, once again, and people who've studied this, they have found basically 6 types of adult audiences. And so this is another thing that might be helpful when you think about what kind of spiritual formation culture you want to help foster in your particular church. There's those adult learners that are looking for fellowship. They tend to like informal discussions about topics relevant to today. Relationship is valuable. You've got people who really want that. You're going to have your traditionalists. They're Bible-oriented, like lecture style, since you all have been put up with here. You've got the neo-traditionalists, returnees, people who've gone to church, left, and now come back, and they're looking for a mentor. They tend to be influenced by culture. You've got those who are social action oriented. They view the church as a launching pad for action. They often, however, view faith as private. Not always, you know. And then finally, this is the one I like, the multiple interest, a combination of any of the above.
Combination of any of the above.
So, thoughts, ideas, we've got a few more minutes.
Would you go over those first 5 things? Types of adults?
Sure.
You said seeking fellowship.
Fellowship, those seeking fellowship. The second one are the traditionalists. They tend to be biblically oriented. They like lecture style. They like sermons. So I love them. But one of the things we're seeing in churches now is some churches are engaging in more conversational style of homiletics, preaching. The traditionalists wouldn't like that. You've got the neo-traditionalists. They often, not always, but they're returnees, people who went to church maybe as a kid, left, and now have come back because they're seeking something. They're often looking for a mentor or some sort of answers to questions. Maybe they've had a life tragedy or something, so they're looking for some sort of context. The fifth is social action. People who look at the church as a launching pad for social action. And and more often than not, they view their faith as private. I mean, they'll feed the homeless for days if you ask them who Jesus is to them. Because they don't think that way. Once again, there's nothing wrong, but they just don't think that way. And then the last one is the combination of all the above.
Do you consider Curcio a type of zealous formation?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, that's one of the Curcio. Yes. Curcio is definitely, I think what Curcio at its best tries to do is look at the whole person, you know, how we view our faith, how we integrate our faith, how we talk about our faith. It's definitely, no, it's not for everyone. Their methodology is not for everyone, but certainly Curcio is a faith formation program. It's not an education program.
Just wondering how you balance the traditionalists who might want the high mass liturgy with the younger folks who may want a rock and roll mass or whatever. I mean, so it's like, so you started off by talking about making sure that we frame the language correctly. And the high mass traditionalist is not a bad thing. So how do you make it a yes and instead of an either but?
I have two thoughts on that, maybe 3 minutes we've got left. But one is, if you're in a place such as the cathedral, that's large enough, and I think that's true here as well as at St. Bart's, where you can have multiple offerings. They don't, one size doesn't fit all. You've got the opportunity to have different types of services that will reach out to different types of people and how they access God. The other thing, though, is once again, is to embrace who and what you are as a faith community, and one size doesn't fit all. And so the fact that you might have a group of people who really prefers a rock and roll mass and wants X, Y, and Z, St. Swithin's may not be the church for them. And that's okay. It's to own who you are and to embrace who you are and say, that's a God-given thing. So as to cut down on the anxiety about that.
I've encountered some of that in the church and in working with the two different groups and bringing them together. We talked about what liturgy was. Liturgy is really our community's dance with God. And if you go to a wedding, there's lots of different kinds of dancing that go on at the wedding.
Right.
Please, everybody, and we need to be open to that in our dance with God. We kind of melted the ice a little bit.
That's a really lovely way to put that. And with that, I will let you go. Thank you so much.